Israel kills the long-serving leader of Hezbollah, flattening buildings in southern Beirut and dramatically escalating its campaign against the terrorist group. Calls for a ceasefire have been decisively ignored. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. Israeli airstrikes near Beirut have continued overnight after the assassination of Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Israel wants to stop the militia group's deadly attacks on its citizens, which have continued for almost a year and displaced tens of thousands. The Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon are also seeing civilians killed and displaced. We'll hear the latest from Jerusalem shortly. We're going to start, though, with a big political story here this week, the debate over negative gearing and capital gains tax. It's 5 years since Labor went to an election promising to rein in the tax breaks for property investors. Now, as the housing crisis worsens, Treasury has been taking a fresh look. And while the Prime Minister played it all down, he's not completely closing the door to some change.
Hi, everyone.
All set?
Ready to go?
We're once again having this conversation around negative gearing.
Some suggestions today in the Nine Papers that the federal government might be tinkering with negative gearing.
But just to confirm, Prime Minister, your government has asked Treasury for modelling?
No, I didn't confirm that.
It's not unusual for governments to get advice from time to time.
Treasury, I'm sure, like other departments, do a range of proposals, policy, ideas.
If you listen closely, you won't hear any denial from the government.
We've got a housing policy and that's not in it.
Labor are cracking under the pressure from the Greens.
The Treasurer dumps this story out there and then he jumps on a plane to go to China.
Are you considering taking negative gearing reform to the next election?
No, we're not. Well, we have no plans to touch it or change negative gearing. We have no plans.
That's code, because they didn't have any plan to change the stage 3 tax cuts, and then they did.
Priam's already ruled it, made it very clear. So, you know...
Hey, Billy, he hasn't ruled it out. He hasn't ruled it out. He just said he's got no plans.
And that tells you that they are in a state of disarray.
Almost a fifth of tax-paying Australians do it, which means there are a lot of votes in keeping it.
They've been secretly working on capital gains tax and negative gearing, despite the fact that this was decisively rejected by the Australian people.
Is there an argument to actually look at it now? We're in a different time to the Bill Shorten time.
But it won't assist supply, and that's the problem here. And the issue of negative gearing is one of supply. They won't have a positive impact on supply.
Inflation has fallen below 3%.
Its lowest level in 3 years.
These are heartening numbers.
We're no closer to an interest rate cut. Encouraging numbers.
That doesn't mean that we've got inflation under control.
We're no closer to inflation sustainably coming within the target range. They're welcome numbers.
We need to see that there's a consistent trend down to the band, and it's going to stay in the band rather than dip in and out. Great. Thanks, everyone.
My guest this morning is the National Senate Leader and Shadow Minister for Transport, Infrastructure and Regional Development, Bridget McKenzie. First, let's check what's making news. Hezbollah has confirmed the killing of its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, while Israel has continued with further airstrikes overnight. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called this an historic turning point, settling a score. Lebanon has announced 3 days of mourning for Nasrallah, while US President Joe Biden says his death is a measure of justice for his many victims, including thousands of Americans, Israelis and Lebanese civilians. Foreign Minister Penny Wong, meanwhile, has urged the United Nations to set a timeline for the international declaration of a Palestinian state. She's told the General Assembly it's time for the cycle of conflict to be broken and says Lebanon cannot become the next Gaza. Well, for the latest, I spoke a short time ago to ABC correspondent Kathryn Diss in Jerusalem. Kathryn, thanks so much for joining us. What does Hassan Nasrallah's death mean for the future of Hezbollah?
Good morning, David. Well, look, this is a significant win for Israel and a major blow for Hezbollah. Israel has now managed to, over the course of just a couple of months, take out an entire generation of Hezbollah leaders. This is likely to cause a power vacuum internally within the organisation, Lebanon, and also possibly the region more broadly, that we could see unrest while they try and replace some of those leaders that they have lost. But it's important to note just the power that Nasrallah wielded over the region and Lebanon in his 3 decades at the helm of the organisation. He managed to build a formidable force, both politically and militarily, with the backing of Iran. So the loss of him and all of those other leaders will shake the organisation, but it does have deep roots within Lebanon and the region, and many experts are saying that they expect that they will be able to fill those positions. They'll have people coming up through the ranks in the wings ready to take on those positions. So it doesn't look like Hezbollah will be gone altogether.
Kathryn, you mentioned Iran there. Now, it feels like over the past 12 months we've had a number of moments described as tipping points that could see things tip into a wider regional war. This feels like a major moment. Has there been any reaction yet from Iran, or are we yet to see that come?
Yeah, there's no question that this is a dangerous moment for the Middle East. There are real fears that this could lead to a broader conflict. The question now is, what will Iran do? We've heard from its Supreme Leader today, who says that this will not destroy Hezbollah. He has called on Muslims across the region to support Lebanon and Hezbollah. For the large part, it's stayed out of this latest escalation of fighting between Hezbollah and Israel. But given that its leadership structure is now so depleted, it may well step in. So there are a few scenarios we could see. Iran could strike back directly, or Iran and its proxies could enter a more broader conflict war right across the region.
And I'm not sure whether you can tell us there from Jerusalem, but are we seeing an acceleration of people trying to get out of southern Lebanon after these events? And apparently some flights are being cancelled at the airport in Beirut. Is that creating difficulty for those trying to flee?
The flights have been cancelled throughout the week, David. It's not just from southern Lebanon, but those strikes from Israel have been hitting right across the country, even in the north of the country. So we have seen more airlines pull out as authorities have warned that the airspace could well be closed. Australians obviously are being urged by the government to leave. They have been urging them to get out for several weeks, if not months now. There are still around 10,000 Australians living in Lebanon. We heard from the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, this week, who has again reiterated those calls, has said that Australia does have a plan to try and get those people out, but gave very little detail. We understand that could be deploying some defence personnel already posted to the Middle East into Lebanon to try and undertake an evacuation mission.
We will see. Kathryn Diss from Jerusalem, thank you. Well, Australia joined the US, EU and some Arab states in calling for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, and clearly that's been ignored. This escalating conflict has the potential to create even more division here and political difficulty for Labor. But right now, the government's focus will be on that issue of getting the many Australian citizens in Lebanon out. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Karen Middleton, Sheridan and John Kehoe. Very good morning to all of you. Karen, just starting on this issue of evacuations before we get to what further developments we might see in the days and weeks ahead there. The Australian government would be looking at contingencies. There are many Australian citizens, some have made Lebanon their home. What planning would be underway right now?
Well, there are interdepartmental committees planning on how they would get Australians out. Back in 2006, when they had to do this, it was a hugely complicated operation. There were officials involved for, I think, a couple of months, and they took people out by sea. Now, it's much more dangerous now, and people are telling me that from inside, those operations, that it is more dangerous and more complicated. Taking people out by sea would be a key option. They would only do it once the the airport was closed, and that was the case last time. But remember, the port was damaged in Beirut as well with that big explosion a few years ago. So that also makes it complicated. They need to get people to Beirut from other parts of Lebanon. The situation is hugely precarious. And then what they did last time, they took people to Cyprus, mostly to Cyprus, but also to Turkey. And I think from Cyprus you had Qantas planes coming in to take them. And it was a hugely expensive operation, both to taxpayers and also people were asked to pay for that last bit, so it doesn't come for free. So, you know, it's massively complicated. It's a different, dangerous situation, and yeah, it looks like water would be the option.
Well, I guess it depends what happens from here. Greg, I'm keen to get your thoughts on why we've seen over the last 2 or 3 weeks Israel really escalate the pressure on Hezbollah. You know, this sort of low-level war, as some have called it, has been going on since October 7 between Hezbollah and Israel across the border there. It's, you know, obviously meant a lot of Israeli citizens have had to flee that part of northern Israel. But why now? Why the pager attack, the walkie-talkie attack, and the big one now, taking out Hassan Nasrallah?
Well, David, I think the timing makes a lot of sense for Israel. There are 3 things Israel's trying to do. It's trying to damage Hezbollah and change the dynamics within Lebanon to the point where its own northern towns are safe again. Secondly, it's trying to re-establish deterrence. Deterrence only works when it lives in the mind of your enemy. When your enemy says, if we hit these guys, they're going to hit us back so hard that we're not willing to accept that. So Israel is having to reassert deterrence, whereas I think deterrence under Biden has failed. But the third thing I think that's important for timing is they want to lock Kamala Harris into their support. They know they're going to get a permission structure from Joe Biden for this. And of course, let's not forget, Hezbollah is the aggressor. They've fired 9,000 missiles at Israel in the last year. So Israel is responding to acts of war by Hezbollah. Biden is going to support them. Harris cannot possibly deviate from Biden. So while Biden is still president, they want all of this locked in. They want her locked in, and they'll get support from Trump.
I was interested in you saying that because it is hard to ignore the timing here of the US elections just around the corner. And, you know, all of this is happening right now before that election is held. Kamala Harris has basically echoed Joe Biden's statement that he's made in the last few hours. In fact, here are some comments that he made. He is still calling for a ceasefire there.
Mr. President, is a ground incursion into Lebanon inevitable? Time for a ceasefire.
Will you visit the hurricane site?
That's what I told him, presumably Benjamin Netanyahu he's referring to there. But those calls for a ceasefire, look, you know, aren't being heeded by Benjamin Netanyahu. Is there a rift between the two?
Look, there's always a rift between those two. But with respect, I'd say more important than his call for a ceasefire, because a ceasefire implies that Hezbollah promises to stop firing missiles at Israel, which it has not done at any stage. You can't have a one-sided ceasefire. But more important than that was his statement that he had a measure of support for the killing of Nasrallah, and that he supported Israel's right to defend itself against Hezbollah, and that Nasrallah had American blood on his hands, and there was a measure of justice in this.
And Kamala Harris backed that in with her statement.
She had to back all that.
You reckon that's what Netanyahu was after?
I think that's a big part of it, yeah.
Yeah, John, look, who knows where this goes from here, but for Australia's part, how concerned will it be about these developments?
Well, obviously there's the humanitarian side, but in the pure politics domestically here in Australia, it does put Labor in a fairly awkward position, doesn't it? Because the pro-Israeli groups in Australia want to see Penny Wong doing a strong backing for their position and what Netanyahu is actually trying to achieve here by obliterating Hezbollah. On the other side, the Greens are putting Labor under a lot of pressure and saying that they're too strongly supporting or not going far enough to criticise Netanyahu as well. So Penny Wong's trying to walk this middle ground, but she's made some interesting comments in the last 24 hours or so about this as well.
Yeah, well, speaking before the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah and certainly the confirmation of the assassination, she did address the UN General Assembly where she said Lebanon cannot become the next Gaza. She talked about the need for a two-state solution again and called for this timeline as well for that to happen, but clearly expressing some concern about civilian casualties in Lebanon.
It is now nearly 300 days since Australia and 152 other countries voted for a ceasefire, and today I repeat that call. Just as I repeat Australia's call for a ceasefire in Lebanon and for parties to fully implement Resolution 1701, Lebanon cannot become the next Gaza.
Greg, is that an understandable sentiment? And what do you make of the call that she's made there at the UN for this timeline on a two-state solution?
Look, I think I have a lot of respect for Penny Wong, but I think that was a very ill-advised speech, and you can only interpret it through the tawdry prism of Australian domestic politics and Labor Green politics. Few basic realities. We're not a major player in the Middle East. Secondly, it's inconceivable you'd have a Palestinian state now when Gaza is still controlled by Hamas, which is dedicated in its charter to anti-Semitism, the destruction of Israel, hatred of the West, and so on. For there to be a Palestinian state, the Palestinians have to agree to an end of claims on Israel. No more terrorism, no more territorial claims, all of that. All of that, as everyone knows, is completely impossible, and Penny knows this herself.
Wouldn't she argue, though, that it would accelerate, whether this is realistic, but it would accelerate the Palestinians getting rid of Hamas?
No.
If that was a requirement of any recognition?
But that's been the requirement of the recognition before. We've been down this road many times. We went through it with the Oslo Accords. You can read the memoirs of Bill Clinton's senior officials. Now, what you're doing is saying you can be utterly intransigent about that. You can murder Israeli civilians in the most horrific, sexually sadistic fashion possible, and we'll give you a diplomatic reward at the end. Now, I don't think she thinks that her speech will have the slightest effect there, but it'll have an effect in Greens' challenged seats that Labor holds here. And the other thing is, if you were sincere, if you were serious about trying to put some diplomatic pressure on to change the situation, you'd be putting massive diplomatic pressure on Iran, and you would make a speech every day urging Hamas to release the Israeli hostages. There could have been a ceasefire 6-9 months ago if they'd been willing to release these hostages whom they're murdering one by one. You'd be making speeches about Hezbollah's terrorism. I can't recall Penny Wong making a single speech about all the Hezbollah rockets which rained down on Israel. But now, when Labor is under challenge from the Greens and Muslim vote, she's making a heroic Winston Churchill speech at the UN about the perfidy of Israel.
Karen, Australia's not alone, though, in suggesting that recognition of a Palestinian state would help deliver a peaceful outcome. But is there momentum behind this, do you think?
I think there's a great deal of anxiety, about what would be achieved if that could be achieved by doing it early. Greg makes the point about rewarding, and there's anxiety about that. But I think there are a lot of countries who've come to the point of saying we're just not getting there. We're not going to get there. We can't get there, and that they need something as a circuit breaker. And to the point about domestic politics that Greg was talking about, the other wild card is the domestic politics in Israel and the personal pressure that Benjamin Netanyahu is under, and the anxiety in other countries about where that, how the degree of influence that is having on decision making as well, and what the end game ultimately is for Netanyahu. So I think there are enormous calculations, there's an enormous amount at stake, and that is a huge decision. Do we seek and push for some kind of two-state solution early, or do we leave it where it is at the end of the process where we are just never getting there?
David, just a final thought on that. How does a two-state solution work if on day one of the Palestinian state they launch a terror attack on Israel? Israel then has to invade what we've just declared is an independent state, and that would be more catastrophic than the situation today.
Well, there would have to be guarantees
Absolutely.
Given about that.
And we've been working on that for 20 years. The idea that somehow or other you can do an end run around the process of negotiating those guarantees it's fantasy. That's why I say this is a performative, symbolic political gesture.
All right, well, let's talk now to our guest this morning, the National Senate Leader, Bridget McKenzie. And to take us there, here was the Israeli Prime Minister a short time ago on the momentum, he says, Israel now has in this war.
These are momentous days. We are at what will be seen as an historic turning point. 1 year ago, on October 7, our enemies attacked us and thought that Israel was on the road to being wiped out. 1 year later, blow after blow, achievement after achievement, they understand how their hopes have dissipated. Israel has momentum. We are winning.
Bridget McKenzie, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, David.
What's your reaction to the assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah?
Well, I believe that Israel has a right to defend itself. I've stood in a Druze Arab community only a few months ago when Hezbollah was raining rockets into the Galilee, and thanks to the Iron Dome, none of them got through. The reality is that Hezbollah is incredibly active on that Lebanese-Israeli border, continually attacking Israel. And I think it's all good and well for us to sort of say we believe in Israel's right to self-defence, but every single time they defend themselves, we somehow seek to minimise that or criticise them. And so I think this is a step that, as Greg has said, they had to be done to show force so that we don't see an escalation on the northern border such as we've seen in Gaza.
So his death is a good thing?
Well, David, I'm not going to play word games with you about something as serious as foreign policy. Civilian casualties in any war are cause for concern amongst all of us. It's why we, are so serious and focused on preventing war at any stage and minimising those civilian casualties where possible. But the reality is Israel is feeling incredibly insecure at the moment, and with good cause. And so I believe Israel does have a right to defend itself against Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iranian matrix, shall we say, in the Middle East.
Do you support calls for an immediate ceasefire?
Well, I just think what Penny Wong's calling for on the floor of the UN is absolutely playing domestic politics with a very, very serious situation. She's trashing our decades-long bipartisan approach to a negotiated two-state solution in the Middle East and this isn't the first time she's done it. She's actually wanting to recognise a state of Palestine before we've got a negotiated settlement. And now she's calling for timelines to be put in place before conditions for settlement. Now, the conditions for settlement, at a very minimum, to stop the war, return the hostages and Hamas to surrender. That should be the absolute precursors before any ceasefire or the war to end there. So for Penny to put our Foreign Minister, to put timelines in place really opens the gate for those terrorist organisations to essentially run down the clock. Then we get to the deadline and where will the pressure sit then? We need to maintain a responsible and respectful position in this. We shouldn't be changing just because domestic politics changes here at home.
But in relation to Israel and Hezbollah in the northern border of Israel, the US President, European states, even some Arab states calling for this immediate ceasefire. Is that something you support?
Well, I support upholding the UN's resolution to actually get Hezbollah out from the northern border of Israel, for them to actually move in and move Hezbollah out, rather than see day in, day out, those communities not only under missile attack, we've got in excess of 70,000 Israelis displaced as a result of being unsafe there. So the UN needs to do their job, and our Foreign Minister should actually be calling on the world to recognise the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organisation. That should be 101 if we're actually wanting to move towards peace in the Middle East.
OK, just to be clear for viewers though, no ceasefire until Hezbollah is removed from that border region.
Well, we want to see, that's the UN resolution. We either uphold international law or we don't, David. We can't pick and choose which bits we want depending on what's happening in Western Sydney. OK, well, let's turn to some domestic issues. Negative gearing, big debate during the week. Would you support any change to negative gearing or capital gains tax? Well, the Australian public's voted against changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax in recent elections with quite a resounding result. The fact that 2.2 million Australians invest in property, and some of them use negative gearing in order to, not have to pass those losses on to renters, is an important fact. I mean, I myself, in a declaration, am a property investor. So the vast majority, as you know, are nurses, coppers, tradies, and 75% of them have, 2 or less homes. So that is the reality. And all the research says, David, that if we want to fix the housing crisis that we're seeing in this country, then we actually need to fix supply. And this actually won't fix that.
But can you understand young would-be home buyers who can't get into the market looking at people who have 5 or 6 negatively geared homes, even looking at politicians who have negatively geared homes and saying, hang on, this isn't fair, I can't even buy one?
Yeah, look, David, I can see in the middle of a housing affordability crisis, which, let's face it, housing affordability is at its worst since records began, right? So this is a very real crisis, not just for renters and first home buyers, but indeed for those who are trying to hold on to their home as interest rates stay incredibly high under a government that can't get its inflation plan going. So, you know, there is a lot of frustration, and rightfully so, out there in community. It's about what are the right levers to pull to assist that. Now, when we were in government, we helped 300,000 Australians into homes, which is fantastic, but it's not just a one silver bullet that's going to fix this. Even this morning, we had reports in the papers of local councils here in Victoria who are saying that state-owned entities such as power corporations and water corporations who are dragging their heels on actually getting those sort of services into new developments is actually driving up costs and kicking out timeframes. So there's a whole raft of measures that need to be addressed to actually address housing affordability. Like, let's get serious. Economists say tweaking around on negative gearing is not going to solve the problem. Well, it depends which economist you talk to be fair. But the supply, as you mentioned... Well, they're like lawyers sometimes. OK, well, supply, as you mentioned, is the key here. What needs to happen to boost supply? Well, there's a range of issues. You know, local councils, as I said, need to open up those developments, get them going, get the service blocks open. We've got a construction industry where we've got costs have risen 40% since 2019. We've got big builds going on in public infrastructure that have really sucked that skilled workforce so slow that could be used for housing construction. And most importantly, we've seen 1.1 million additional people arrive here in Australia. OK, with but on supply, on housing supply, are you saying slow down those big builds? David, it's a supply and demand thing. So if you're going to pour more demand in to the tune of 1.1 million additional people, that is going to cause supply issues because we cannot build enough houses. Would you slow down those big builds at the state level, stop federal funding for some of those big builds to free up the construction workers for housing? Well, I think we've been pretty clear that one of the things we will be looking at is the union's hold on the migration skilled list. I mean, construction has been screaming for workforce for a long time, not just in public infrastructure builds, but in our housing constructor and residential sector. And the unions have made sure that despite the demand and need for that skilled workforce of tradies in our community, they're not allowed to come in. Of the 1.1 million people coming in, we're not allowed to say we need more chippies, plumbers or sparkies. But you're going to cut immigration, that is actually, David, a bottleneck on one of the key issues of why we can't get the houses built. But the question was, are you going to slow down the spending on the big builds, big construction projects to free up workers for housing? Well, I'm going to have to get in and be able to have a look at the books. The reality is... So you might do that? Well, David, if you can stop verballing me, you know, they've put $2.2 billion of Commonwealth taxpayers' money on the table to Victoria for the suburban rail loop, for instance, and there's no cost-benefit analysis, there's no business case that's been submitted to Infrastructure Australia, and we're 2.5 years in. So I can commit to you that we'll be running the ruler over these public infrastructure spends because we know CFMEU-controlled projects are costing taxpayers 30% more and they're sucking those construction workers out and they're driving up inflation. And that's not Bridget McKenzie saying it, it's the Reserve Bank Governor. So there's a lot to look at should we have the great privilege to get the infrastructure portfolio post-election. Just a couple of other things I wanted to ask you about. Supermarkets, we've seen the competition watchdog this week launch legal action against Coles and Woolworths over alleged fake discounts. Do you reckon that court action will change the behaviour of the supermarkets? Well, they're hard beasts to tame, the supermarkets. I remember one of the first Senate inquiries I was in 14 years ago was the $1 milk Senate inquiry and the impact that was having on our dairy producers. Look, the ACCC is doing its job addressing these fake discounts. You know, if what is alleged is proved, the supermarkets have been, you know, pocketing the profits while the ticket price is high and then profiting on the increased volumes once it's declared a special. So I think this is exactly what the ACCC needs to be doing, and I think it really highlights the behaviour of the supermarkets in both ends of the supply chain suffering the results of market domination. We know that Woolies and Coles you know, have 62%, I think, of our supermarket grocery sector. And that's why we've, from the start, the National Party and the Liberal Party have been focused on, you know, making sure if you breach the code, the supermarket code, you don't just get the slap on the wrist of like a lazy $187,000, which I think these big businesses would see as the cost of doing business, but you're going to be slapped with $2 million. And we've got divestiture powers.
Well, I was going to ask you about that.
Should a court choose to, you know, empower that in our back pocket as well?
Yeah, these divestiture powers, the breakup powers, would that only apply to supermarkets? Can you just clarify, do you want it to apply to any other sectors?
Well, the proposal and the legislation that we'll be bringing to Parliament, we hope the Labor Party does support it. The Prime Minister is liking to pick and choose which big businesses he supports and protects and which ones he doesn't. But we will be bringing a piece of legislation that does go specifically to the grocery market, implements those tougher fines, implements the divestiture power and supermarket commissioner, which I think is the right way to go. But what we saw from, I think it was the Financial Review, had a poll this week just gone that actually said 76% of Australians, for the aviation sector for instance, 76% of Australians say it's not competitive enough, and that's why they're paying more for airline tickets than they should. We all know this. And I think it was like 46% of Australians supported splitting up the Qantas group, which on its own has 62% of the aviation sector. So the lack of competition in other industries is impacting choice and it's impacting price for the Australian consumer. And we're always going to be on the side of more competition, more capacity and decreasing prices.
So just to be clear, do you think the power should be there to force the breakup of an airline like Qantas?
Well, advanced economies like the US, like the UK, have these type of arrangements. We're putting a sector-specific arrangement to the Parliament in coming months. We're hoping for a lot of support, not just from the Greens and the crossbench, but indeed from the Labor Party, because if the Prime Minister is serious, he's got to put his vote where his mouth is and back us on this.
Do you want the power there to break up an airline?
Well, I think what I've been calling for and what the Coalition's been calling for and what the Australian public clearly wants is more competition in the aviation sector.
But a breakup power, the divestiture power?
Kathryn King had a lot of talk about her aviation white paper. David, it's silent on competition reforms.
What's your answer on this
2.5
question?
years later.
Sorry,
and
I'll just
Jim
ask one more time. Would you like a breakup power for airlines?
I want a more competitive industry, David. I've been really clear about that. There's in excess of 10 different things the government could do right now to actually make it more competitive, but they're not doing anything, and Australians are getting sick and tired of the protection racket.
But what's your position on this? Just one more time, would you like a breakup power for airlines?
I want robust competition framework that actually delivers for the Australian people, and that means more choice and lower prices.
Just on electric vehicles, Senator, we've seen the US move towards a ban on Chinese-made electric vehicles. They're worried about the software and the hardware, these cars being used for surveillance or even remotely controlled. Should Australia ban Chinese-made vehicles?
It's not the Coalition's plan. We won't be banning EVs. I'm working right now on a low emissions transport policy for the Coalition that, we've already released the principles I'm using to develop that go to affordability, that go to choice, obviously go to emissions reduction, but also don't ensure that poor Australians and rural and regional Australians are subsidising more wealthy Australians. So it has to be equitable with respect to that. I think the more concerning thing around the EV issue here in Australia at right now is that Labor is expecting Australians that buy Toyota hybrids, their Ford diesel or petrol utes to actually be subsidising EVs from China. That's effectively the policy that the government put in place this year. It's very, very concerning.
So would you scrap that, the vehicle emissions standard?
Well, we voted against it, David. We've been unequivocal in that. We think it's crazy as you move to transition an entire vehicle fleet that you're going to make poor Australians pay the ticket price.
So you'd repeal it?
And rich Australians get the tax break.
Would you
that
repeal
is
it?
actually what's been set up. Well, as I said, I'm actually actively developing our low emissions transport policy right now, and I'll have more to say closer to the election.
All right. Will that include a road user charge, perhaps, as well, to ensure that people who drive electric vehicles pay for the roads in the way that people who pay petrol excise do?
Look, David, this is one of the great privileges of holding the Treasury benches. You get to solve wicked problems such as this. I wrote to the Treasurer on this. I've spoken internationally. The High Court's ruled on the need for the Treasurer to get going on a national way to actually
You do it?
tax EV users in terms of their use of roads, because right now it's only petrol excise that's actually funding those roads. And they're, again, doing nothing. I think what you're seeing from Jim Chalmers is a very frustrated Treasurer, and that's why you've seen great Labor right luminaries call this government insipid, weak, because that's exactly what they are. They can't even get a leak right this week.
Well, we look forward to seeing your policy proposals. Bridget McKenzie,
You will.
Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
All right, a bit to follow up there. Let's get back to our panel. We're joined once again by Karen Middleton, Greg Sheridan and John Kehoe. Look, just quickly on the Middle East, notably Bridget McKenzie not calling or joining the calls for the ceasefire in relation to Israel and Hezbollah there. That is a far more pro-Israel position than we're hearing from the government, Karen.
Yeah, and they've taken a far more pro-Israel position than the government all the way through this with Gaza and now with the situation in Lebanon. So they're clearly not shifting to a broader position in this event either.
And just, John, on the airline breakup power, there's been this question mark there for a few weeks now about this. What do you make of that? Is the coalition going to extend this divestiture power from supermarkets to airlines?
I don't think so, because I think Peter Dutton's made it pretty clear that they want to stop at the supermarkets. They don't want to send too much of a anti-business sort of sentiment out there before the election, although you do get the sense that Bridget, if she had her way, that they would try to look at doing this. But I think probably the Nationals have been reined in from the Liberals and say, let's just confine it to the big supermarkets.
We've given you nuclear power. That's enough maybe for now.
She got out a bit ahead of the coalition position on that the last time she was out. I think she got her knuckles wrapped. She did seem to be leaving the option open of a tax on EV users, though, I thought. I didn't think she ruled that out entirely.
Well, let's go to that leak that the Senator referred to there on negative gearing, because during the week, David Crowe, James Massola and the Nine papers had this great story that Treasury has been looking at negative gearing and capital gains tax. And there was a bit of a messy response to all of this. The Prime Minister, eventually tried to hose it all down.
Well, we have no plans to touch it or change negative gearing. What we're concerned about is supply of housing, and this, I'm not convinced it'll make any difference that's positive when it comes to supply.
All right, so he sounds there like he's not inclined to do anything here, but Treasury, we know, has been looking at it. There's been a lot of questions as to did the Treasurer ask them to look at it or not. John, what's going on?
Well, there's no doubt I think there's a bit of sympathy within Labor to revisit this issue, despite the 2019 election rejection of changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax. Obviously, housing affordability is probably second to cost of living, I think, amongst the voters. They're under pressure from Greens on the cost of housing for renters and also
those Labor MPs
prices.
who are under pressure from the Greens are more inclined to say, yeah, maybe we should do something here.
Yeah, and so I think, it's not unreasonable that the Treasurer, whether he explicitly asked or tacitly acknowledged and endorsed Treasury having a bit of a revisit of this, that's reasonable. But how
it's just on that, because there's a lot of focus on that, but is it really that strange that a Treasurer would, on all sorts of tax issues, particularly if they're running hot in the public debate, say, can you tell me what's what? What impact is it having on supply or rents or these sorts of things?
It's not strange, but it is interesting, and it's interesting that this news leaked out at a pretty awkward time for the Treasurer as well. I don't think the leak came from him or his office, because that week there was other things happening in his portfolio.
Well, he wanted to focus on inflation, right, Karen? And we'll get to those figures. Yeah. He had his big trip to China. This was not the week that Jim Chalmers wanted to be talking about a negative gearing discussion.
You could see that all over his face on his first question and the 6 that followed at the press conference on inflation, when inflation, at least the monthly figure, had come back down within the target range. We know that that's, it's not enough for the reserve, but he wanted to be talking about other things. Remember, when the Prime Minister says he's not convinced that this would do anything for supply, remember in 2019, the policy they took to the election was badged as a supply positive policy because it would grandfather existing negatively geared arrangements, but it would focus future arrangements on newly constructed housing. Now, we know that most homes that are negatively geared now, it's existing housing stock. That's where the claims are made. So the argument was at the time, if you're focusing the discount, removing it, future discounts for existing homes and only on newly constructed homes, that's naturally going to make people who are looking for a tax advantage to purchase newly constructed homes, boosts the supply. But they're saying the opposite to that now.
But it's not going to help. Well, it'll be interesting to see what Treasury thinks if they do this analysis and have a look. Even more interesting. Have a look at it. Just on the politics, have a look at this. These are some of the Labor marginal seats where negative gearing is most commonly used or most popular. You can see Bennelong and Chisholm at the top of the list there. Bennelong's margin is 1%. You've got 10% of the voters there, or more than 10%, who are negative gearers. Likewise in Chisholm down in Melbourne as well. So you can see the political sensitivity of touching this. Greg, it's remained this sort of third rail of Australian politics for 5 years now. Is there any chance they go there?
Well, I tell you who supports Labor going down this road more strongly than anyone else. That's Peter Dutton. Because this would be a fantastic... He is saying every night, saying his prayers, I hope Chalmers wins this argument against Albanese, because those 4 seats would probably go. But 2 things about negative gearing. First of all, it would make no difference at all to the price of houses. Even the studies which say it would are full of flawed assumptions, and they believe that people would behave exactly the same as they behave now, but with entirely different tax incentives. That's the only way you get those figures. And it's very typical of Australia. We're having this massive discussion about something which is of almost no consequence, and we're not discussing all the things which are critical to housing supply, all the government regulations, all the costs that are put on developing a block of land. As Bridget McKenzie said, the failure to import builders, tradies, all this sort of thing, the zoning restrictions.
Well, and the state stamp duties.
The state stamp duties. And then the final point here, David, the states have lumbered massive land tax increases. So there is already a huge cost to holding property. There is already a huge disincentive to holding property. And you can't avoid the land tax. You can't negative gear your way out of the
clearly
land
there's
tax.
enough of an incentive for some people to have multiple properties that are negative geared.
Of course,
Do you think there'd be some benefit politically, I'm talking about here? I mean, there'd be a small budget benefit as well, that maybe you could use the money for building more public housing, but some political benefit in saying you can't have more than 3 or 4 properties is enough.
Well, there'd be a few people with lots and lots of properties, but the other very negative thing happening in Australia is there's a hostility and a campaign against anything which is successful. A company which makes big profits, that's what you want. So then it will buy new businesses and start new businesses and employ more people and so on.
Sure.
But that's regarded as a bad thing. And with negative gearing, the normal way for a normal person to build wealth is through property. And millions...
But there are so many who can't.
Still the top,
there are so many who can't. And that's the thing. This is why so many people are so agitated about this. They see people with multiple properties. They can't get in.
So help them, but don't penalise people who have saved for 20 years, bought a second property, they've built up a little bit of security.
They're the ones they're bidding against.
It's still the people on the highest incomes that are benefiting most from these from negatively gearing properties. It's the argument about doctors and about nurses and people on lower incomes is a little bit of a fallacy, because it still is mostly people on those top echelon, in that top echelon.
That's because they have the highest marginal tax rate, so they get the highest deduction, and they've also got the money. But I think it is a bit of a sideshow, really, because, I mean, the studies show from Grattan and Deloitte Access Economics, it might add 2 to 4% to house prices, so it's not the major contributor to house prices. But also, there is a risk, if you turn some of this off, that actually pushes up rent, because it does impact the supply of homes at the margin. So you might be able to help some first home buyers, change the distribution from investors to buyers, but at the same time, potentially hurts renters. And that was what Albanese is getting at, into seeing no evidence that would help supply.
That's going to help supply. And look, I think even if there is a small financial benefit that would allow some money to be used elsewhere, the political cost, as we've discussed, is something the government will be weighing very carefully
indeed. The political
indeed.
cost is way too high.
Look, the Treasurer, I think we all agree, wasn't thrilled at this leak and the news. He wasn't the one behind, flying any kite here. He said very clearly on the day, the real story is inflation. This is where he wanted the focus to be. And have a look at the inflation number, because, there's some improvement here. Now, there's two lines to look at here. The underlying rate is the yellow one. The blue one is the headline rate. So the blue line has come back down inside the Reserve Bank target band. It came down to 2.7%. Now, that's affected by some temporary factors, including those energy subsidies that won't last forever. So that you would assume is going to bounce back up once they come off. But that underlying rate, John, is coming down closer to the band, down to 3.4%. Why is that improving? Can the government take any credit for that one?
Well, they will take some credit for it. I think they'll be encouraged by underlying inflation when you sort of strip out those energy bill rebates. It is heading in the right direction, 3.4%. The monthly numbers can be a bit volatile, so we shouldn't get too carried away with it. But look, it's not a bad result, but inflation is still a bit sticky and too high. And Michelle Bullock got out early and said, she predicted, obviously, that this was going to be artificially reduce the headline figure. So don't expect a rate cut because the headline's back to 2.7%.
Well, here's what she said on this the day before those inflation numbers dropped.
The point I would make is that if tomorrow we get an inflation number which has got a 2 in front of it, so it's back in the band, that doesn't mean that we've got inflation under control. It doesn't mean that inflation is sustainably back within the band. We need to see that there's a consistent trend down to the band, and it's going to stay in the band rather than dip in and out.
That trend is there. It's not there yet, but it's trending in the right direction. What does that mean? When do we get a rate cut?
Well, the money markets are still pricing in a strong chance of a rate cut in December this year.
Despite what the governor said.
Yeah, so they're sort of betting against what the Reserve Bank governor's saying. That's the smart money in financial markets. Most market economists think it's going to be about February. Some others think it'll be longer. So, look, there's varied views. I think let's not get too carried away with the monthly number. We'll get a quarterly number for September, I think at the start of November roughly. Right. And that'll be quite a telling sort of number. But it feels like the RBA is going to be pretty patient and wants to make sure inflation is firmly on track to get inside that 2 to 3% band.
And if they wait till February, is there a chance of a double rate cut like we saw in the United States? So that was floated around this week. I mean, the government imagine.
That's right. All an election straight off the back of that one.
The celebration, yes.
Yeah, all right. Supermarkets mentioned there with Bridget McKenzie. They're getting tough with the big supermarkets, the ACCC, Coles and Woolies, this legal action. The example that the ACCC gave is a packet of Oreo biscuits, sat for $3.50 for a long time, and then they jacked it up to $5 a packet for a little bit, short period of time, and then dropped to $4.50 and said it was a discounted rate. Greg, no one terribly shocked, I don't think, to hear this happening.
Well, look, I can't take the ACCC altogether seriously here. I mean, they've done the impossible, made me feel sympathetic for the supermarkets. I mean,
let's explain that to me, how?
Well, look, I've been married 30-something years. We've bought lots of furniture over that period. Every single piece of furniture we've ever bought has been allegedly on discount in the store. Does that mean I should go and sue the store? I mean, you'd have to be a genius to find a piece of furniture that was not allegedly on discount.
Yeah, but we're not talking about furniture, we're talking about groceries.
I know, but do people really think that because the Oreos are down 50 cents, and so the ACCC has got to define how long a product has to stay at the higher price before you can discount it? I mean, no human being thinks to themselves in the supermarket, gosh, the cornflakes are discounted by 25 cents, yippee, and then finds to their heartbreak that in fact it was a fraudulent
But is it misleading? Look, it's got to play out of the courts, but is it misleading?
No,
I think it is part of the hostility to business. We run an oligopoly economy, which means we've got very big companies, and they get resented in the way people resent government.
But come on, if they're duping Australian shoppers.
But isn't it dupe to say the thing has come down? But I can't believe.
But you're saying
that
we should all disbelieve discount signs.
Of course. Have you personally ever gone into a supermarket and said, "Yippee, the Oreos are 30 cents cheaper. Thank God they're discounted now. I'm going to buy them."
It'd be nice to know.
It's just a hunch, but I reckon the Australian consumer might be more on the side of the ACCC than on the side of the businesses and the argument that Greg's putting right there.
All right.
But that's crude populism. That's the ACCC engaging in its own populism.
Well, there's a pub test here. Does it pass the pub test? And people might say no, because this seems to be you put the price up temporarily and you reduce it. But then there's the legal test, and that's what's going to come down to what's a reasonable amount of time for a price to be elevated before you drop it again to allege that it's a discount as well. But I think just quickly, like the linking of it to inflation, as some have done in the political debate, is actually wrong. This might be bad corporate conduct and behaviour that the ACCC could throw the book at, but it's not the cause of inflation.
No, fair enough. Look, final one, Ukraine. I just want to get some thoughts on this because some really concerning developments during the week. We know Ukraine has been seeking these long-range missiles from, is it from the European countries, the UK, Germany and so on, and they've been, in the US have been wondering whether to give Ukraine these long-range missiles. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, said this week, OK, if that happens, I'm going to lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons in this conflict. I caught up with the Ukrainian ambassador, Vasyl Miroshnichenko, for the podcast this week. He says ignore Russia's nuclear threats.
Russia, for the past 2.5 years, actually for the past 10 years, have been using nuclear to threaten Ukraine, to threaten and intimidate the countries which are supporting the country. And every time we see he's using the same card when there is a weakness. Of course, nuclear threats should be taken seriously, but we've seen that the red lines have been crossed a number of times and they've been mostly bluffed.
The full conversation, you can catch that using the QR codes there on screen. Greg, what do you think? Should Putin's nuclear threats be ignored?
Well, you've got to take it seriously, but I think it has been a tremendous mistake of the Biden administration to escalate so gradually in empowering Ukraine. Much better. The old DLP Senator Vince Gare used to say, if you're going to be a dog, be an Alsatian. Much better if you're going to ask Ukraine to fight or you're going to help it to fight, then give it every weapon and every discretion within reason. If Ukraine had been armed by the West before Putin's invasion, that might have deterred invasion. What you've seen is that Putin has been successful in deterring Biden. Biden has not been successful in deterring Putin. I do think that, God forbid Trump should say something sensible, but I do think Trump is right. They're going to have a negotiation soon, and I don't think Ukraine can liberate Crimea and so on. But I would think if Russia is striking Ukrainian territory, Ukraine has a right to strike weapons depots and so forth inside Russia. Give them that. Otherwise, you allow Putin, with the mere threat of nuclear escalation, to veto Western policy.
But Trump's also saying he'd have it fixed in 24 hours.
Yeah, that's rubbish.
The only way he could do that is to capitulate to Putin, which is alarming.
I agree. So I'm not making a pro-Trump statement. I'm just saying I do think they're going to have to negotiate.
All right, our panel, John Kehoe, Greg Sheridan and Karen Middleton, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with Megan Herbert, who cartoons for the Nine newspaper group, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Mike.
Megan, it's a case of down. Trust is down as far as the supermarkets go because they're accused of gouging. David Pope looks like he's done the worst theme park ever, Woolies World, where we are the Wallies. Gina here that's kind of a very 80s stack act.
It is. I think she might also need maybe a seatbelt and some airbags, given the ride she's been on.
We will allege consumers are being taken for a ride.
Yes.
The prices are up and the trust is down.
I think so.
Peter Brolman, what's the special?
They take us for 2 mugs for the price of 1.
Yeah.
There is no moment in history you can ever convince me that 2 for $9 on salt and vinegar chips is a good deal.
Kathy Wilcox has done the graph here. Up, profits are up as the discount period here seems to be...
all over the place.
All over the place.
She's got the index finger pointing up here, of course. I think that the supermarkets might be using a different finger when it comes to consumers at the moment.
Everyone has picked up on the Prime Minister and his investment property. Matt Golding here has got him flying the neg gearing policy kite. Whose kite does it belong to?
Yes, he's doing a bit of a Ben Franklin here, Albanese, and hoping he doesn't get hit by the Liberal bolt.
The bolt of Dutton. It's
Yes.
not my kite, it's the Treasury kite.
The negative gearing.
I did love this John Kehoe cartoon. For auction, a rare opportunity to fix negative gearing and the capital gains discount.
And that's a late bid from the gentleman in the ironic band T-shirt. That is a bid, sir?
Yeah, maybe he needs to get a new T-shirt, Rage Inside the Machine.
Yeah, rage right alongside the machine.
Adam Band here, who's got his little green paddle. I love that.
He looks very cross.
Megan, the government says it's lowering emissions, but they just keep approving coal mines.
The world scientists have said that the only way for us to stay on track to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming is to not open any more coal mines. But, you know, what would they know?
You've picked up on this too, Megan. Run us through this.
So a new runway was announced. We're thrilled to announce a third runway. Extra capacity, increased production.
Yeah.
And another year of growth.
Yeah.
With the CO2 emissions
going up and up.
Yeah.
Jess Harwood has picked up on the cute washing that goes on. Ministerial diary, Tanya Plibersek MP, Environment Minister, July, cuddly critter photo shoot.
August, Albo at Pacific Islands Forum, spruiking our climate policy.
September 24th, approved massive coal mines, same day, cute Bilby media.
October 8 to 10, host Global Nature Summit. Ring zoo, rent koalas. I think Tanya is onto something though, Mike, because koalas are very distracting.
Yeah.
Tell us some environmental facts.
Australia is the #1 emitter in the OECD per capita of carbon emissions.
Here's a koala that I prepared earlier.
David Rowe has drawn backdrops for the Australian Financial Review Power issue, and they set it up at the front of the lodge by the look of it to photograph the Prime Minister, and he's on the cover. Gough Whitlam here in the background and Rabbitohs. David's done specific backdrops for politicians, which is fantastic.
Incredible amount of work. When does he sleep?
RBA Governor Michelle Bullock seems to be playing with the percentage sword here.
I'm pretty sure she's about to twist it.
Twist it, yeah.
I can feel it coming.
Jim Chalmers is sort of patting the Slade dragon with...
This is how to train an inflation dragon.
Max Chandler-Mather, the Greens member for Griffith.
Max is a bit representative of the hopes and dreams of owning a home or renting an affordable property just being washed away there.
Senator Price from the Northern Territory.
Yes, I've seen enough community theatre to know that glint in her eye. She's just waiting for the right moment to jump on and upstage somebody.
Megan, it's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks, it's great to see you, Mike. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. John.
David, the final budget outcome is going to be handed down tomorrow from Jim Chalmers and Katie Gallagher. It's going to show a surplus in the mid-teens. For the second straight year, there'll be a surplus under Labor, but then it's not going to be a third surplus in the current financial year because those iron ore export prices have fallen back to more normal levels. So my prediction is Labor's not going to want to have a third budget next year. Ooh. And so therefore I reckon we're going to see an election in the first half of April because that's going to be after 2 RBA board meetings in February on April 1, and that's going to maximise the chance of an interest rate cut before the election.
Interesting. Take the rate cut, no budget, go to the election. They'd still have to do a pre-election budget update from Treasury. Anyway, interesting tip. Greg.
So mine is also related to an election. As I said, I think in this country we have all these debates about non-issues, and we're having one now about AUKUS. Gareth Evans and Paul Keating are saying that our mythical nuclear subs, which we get on Star Trek time sometime in the next century, are going to compromise our sovereignty, as if that's the main issue in Australian defence policy. Meanwhile, the Albanese government is running down and destroying the Australian Defence Force. But I don't want to let the opposition off the hook here. If they are at all serious about defence, they have to make a big budget commitment as their opposition bid. Now, if they don't make a big funding commitment, heavily in excess of Albanese's, then they're not serious on defence either.
We will see. Karen.
Just on the Lebanon situation, I heard an Australian in Lebanon on radio this week saying, look, I feel safe at the moment, I'm just going to sit tight. Having been caught in some sticky situations overseas myself, things change very, very dramatically, and if you wait until you don't feel safe, it's it's late. It's very late and it's very dangerous. And if it was me, I'd be getting out of Lebanon right now.
Yeah, well said.
Good advice. All right, thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, we're all guilty of the odd slip of the tongue. This one was a diplomatic doozy. We'll leave you with British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and the return of the sausages. Thanks for watching.
I call again all parties to pull back from the brink. I call again for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of the sausages, the hostages.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.